Hi, I'm Marcin Kuśmierczyk. Welcome to Eastern Insights. Why does Eastern Europe's perspective on global affairs matter? Because here, history and geopolitics collide in ways that shape our world. Yet these voices often go unheard. This podcast bridges this gap. Each episode translates in-depth analysis from my Polish YouTube channel, Polityka Zagraniczna, which means international politics. For the last few years, this platform has dissected foreign policy, security, and the forces shaping Eastern Europe. Using AI tools like 11 Labs, we adapt these nuanced insights into English, preserving their depth while making them accessible to all. Whether we're unpacking Russia's latest moves, EU debates, or security challenges in Central Europe, our mission is simple: to foster informed dialogue by sharing Eastern Europe's untold stories. If you're curious about the world beyond headlines, subscribe now. Join me as we decode the complexities of global affairs, one Eastern European insight at a time.
Will Ukraine be broken? That's the question, isn't it? And it is a huge one, not just for Ukraine itself, or even its neighbors here in Eastern Europe, but truly for the entire continent, for the future of transatlantic relations. Honestly, it's a question that echoes across the global stage right now, because the pressure building on Kiev, it is intense. It could become genuinely overwhelming. And whether Ukraine withstands that pressure, whether it avoids being torn apart, or somehow turned into a managed space, well, that outcome could very well define the next chapter of the international order. It affects the status of so many nations. Not just Ukraine, not just our part of Europe, but I believe the whole continent. Why is it that critical? Stick around. Let's break it down. If you want a stark picture of just how tough Ukraine's position is right now, look no further than the information war. On this front, the Ukrainians are constantly being pushed back. They're now defending the most fundamental truths about this conflict, things that frankly should be undeniable. Ukraine finds itself fighting simply to maintain its status as the victim in this invasion. You can hear it in President Zelensky's voice. Just listen to his interview. Frankly, he sounds desperate about this. We are seeing this gradual blurring of the lines, this hesitation to simply state the fact. Russia is the aggressor. The US administration, for instance, consistently avoids using that specific word. They even reportedly refused to sign a joint G7 declaration after the attack on Sumy, apparently out of fear it might disrupt potential negotiations with Russia. And what's even more concerning, Ukrainians have been publicly blamed for the war, repeatedly, even at the highest levels, including by the President of the United States. Now, maintaining that status, that of the victim, the nation defending its own internationally recognized borders against violent aggression, it is absolutely crucial. It might be the most important line of defense for Ukraine's sovereignty in international politics right now. Because think about it. If you can cast doubt on whether Russia actually violated Ukraine's border, then you can start questioning Ukraine's sovereignty itself, its territorial integrity. Suddenly, Ukraine isn't a recognized state defending itself under international law. No, it's pushed into this murky, ambiguous zone. We start hearing things like, well, we don't really know whose land this should be, or where should the border really run, or even, who's really to blame here, or it goes even lower, to arguments like when some American figures recently suggested it's pointless, even wrong, to fight a much stronger country. Donald Trump, talking about Ukraine, said, quote, "You don't start a war with a country 20 times bigger than yourself." See the shift? We are moving away from a world that was, at least in theory, trying to uphold universal rules based on international law, especially now that the system's strongest player seems less willing to enforce those rules. And we are sliding back, almost automatically, into the old, familiar logic, the logic of power zones, spheres of influence. But here's the paradox. This situation also clearly exposes the lie behind the narrative that the West is to blame for everything. Because if Ukraine was just some artificial creation, some pawn managed by the West, Well, Donald Trump wouldn't need to sound so angry, would he? And the Ukrainians wouldn't be described as somehow acting against their supposed patron's orders. They are acting independently. That much is absolutely clear. Now, obviously, more powerful states have a bigger impact on world events. That is undeniable. But there is a tendency, especially among current or former great powers, to completely dismiss the role of smaller and medium-sized countries. They are often just seen as noise, background interference. It is a massive underestimation. These countries can and do have a real impact on history. You see this clearly in the Russian worldview, of course. It's almost baked into their perception of reality. But you see it in the United States too. That attitude of, you don't have any cards to play here. Without us, you mean nothing. It is becoming increasingly obvious that the Americans are trying to frame Ukraine primarily as a subject for negotiation between the truly powerful, between Washington and Moscow. And look, this isn't gossip or speculation. Americans are saying this directly. Listen to this Republican senator, for example. Slight pause for emphasis. Zelensky is going to play hardball, but you know what? He's not even in the game. It's going to be Putin and President Trump and the people on our side that will end up making this decision for the future of Ukraine. Oof, hard to hear, isn't it? But great powers are not the only actors that matter. History shows us that time and again. Think about Poland's victory over the Soviets in 1920. On paper, it absolutely should not have happened. Poland should not have won the Battle of Warsaw. And yet, they did. And that victory? Its significance for the course of European history and even global events. It's truly hard to overstate. It mattered. A lot. So, can the Ukrainians pull off something similar? I don't know. It is going to be incredibly difficult. They might not succeed. They might get crushed under the weight of empires looking to carve things up again. Draw new lines on the map. Okay, this part's ours, that part's yours. But one thing is undeniable. They are trying. They are fighting tooth and nail to build and keep their own country. And regardless of what anyone might think about the Ukrainian leadership, its flaws, its corruption, its sometimes reckless moves, or about parts of Ukrainian society, that effort, especially the effort of that million-strong army standing against the Russian Federation, that is something we absolutely should not underestimate when we think about the future of our entire continent. It feels like we're reaching a point where we can start piecing together the main lines of current American policy towards Ukraine. And boiled down, it looks something like this. For the U.S., Ukraine is no longer primarily a battlefield for upholding the principles of the international system, largely because the Americans themselves seem increasingly intent on changing that system. Instead, Ukraine is seen more as a secondary issue now, a complication, something that drains American resources and unnecessarily antagonizes Russia, complicating the bigger global game they're playing. From this perspective, Ukraine is seen as more of a European problem. The threat feels much more direct for them. The view in Washington seems to be that America somehow got drawn into a war that should have been avoided, and needs to end as soon as possible. Though ending it won't be nearly as simple as someone like Trump might suggest. And at the same time, America expects a return on its investment. The support given to Ukraine isn't seen just as aid. It's increasingly viewed as an obligation. Something the Ukrainians will eventually have to repay. What seems to be dominating the thinking in Washington today is that classic, almost transactional, power politics mindset. It's largely stripped of the ideological, institutional framework we've usually associated with America on the global stage. And that way of thinking, it could be deadly for Ukraine. It represents a potentially massive, unpredictable shift in what has been the American empire's foreign policy paradigm. Think about it. An America moving away from the institutions that underpin the international order. An America focused primarily on reorganizing global trade and rebuilding alliances strictly on its own terms. That's a very different beast from the systemic hegemon enforcing international law and promoting universal values. This new America? It's arguably no longer a fundamental systemic rival to Russia in the same way it was. In fact, the Russians clearly hope a Trump administration might even help dismantle the existing order. An order that, crucially, empowers Russia's neighbors with ambitions of self-determination. From Russia's perspective, and it seems, increasingly from the perspective of many in Washington now, it's far better, far more efficient, to sort things out through bilateral talks between the big guys. Just hash it out. However, because the Americans do expect that return on investment in Ukraine, and because of that classic great power logic, we probably shouldn't expect the US to just hand Ukraine over to Russia entirely. The US doesn't typically just give up influence easily. But how they exert that influence, that, it seems, is changing. What's more, American impatience for a deal could even lead to something like an economic blow against Russia if Moscow drags its feet in negotiations. For Ukraine, potentially playing on this American desire for a quick resolution, while painting Russia as the reluctant, difficult party, that might be their only real leverage to maintain a meaningful relationship with the US right now. But, and this is a huge but, none of this removes the fundamental, terrifying risk for Ukraine. The risk of becoming simply a bargaining chip in a deal struck over their heads by Washington and Moscow. Influence in Ukraine just isn't a primary US interest anymore, especially given this strategic reorientation America appears to be undergoing. Let's be blunt. It is hard to doubt that the Americans are capable of sacrificing Ukraine if they genuinely believe it serves their interests elsewhere. If they think mending ties with Russia brings benefits, say in dealing with China or in gaining leverage over Europe, they might just do it. Interests in Central and Eastern Europe could be deemed, shall we say, expendable. It doesn't have to happen, but the risk is far from negligible. Maybe the Americans genuinely think they can use Russia against China. That seems like a risky illusion, perhaps. Or maybe they see Russia primarily as a tool, a way to pressure Europe. To use European dependence on US security, leverage that underlying fear, to force concessions. Perhaps force Europe to align more closely with US geo-economic goals in the rivalry with China. Slight pause. And this brings us to a truly difficult point. We, all of us, seem to have gotten used to this war. It makes less and less of an impression on the daily news cycle, doesn't it? Think about the recent brutal attack on Sumy. It sounds cold to say, but did that news truly register deeply with many people outside Ukraine? Another tragic attack. Another sad headline. Maybe a fleeting thought of, oh, we have to end this war. It's so tragic. And then, we move on. We act as if it's happening somewhere very far away. Something that doesn't really concern us directly. But the reality is, we are, potentially, just one step away from becoming objects in this game ourselves. One step away from our status, not just regionally, but the status of the entire continent, being put on the negotiating table. We risk becoming pawns in a game played by great powers in capitals far outside Europe. Because subjugating Ukraine, in the current stark logic of international politics, leads directly towards the potential subjugation of our entire continent. The disintegration of Ukraine, removing that crucial factor of resistance from the equation, especially on the ruins of an international order that was, however imperfectly, based on law. That path leads, almost inevitably, to the subordination of the old continent. Right now, there is an army of over 1 million Ukrainians tying down Russian forces far from our borders. It gives us a buffer, a sense of distance. But that army, there is nothing currently on the continent capable of replacing it. Not quickly, anyway. Not in terms of sheer mass and immediate capability. European military capabilities? They're either still heavily reliant on the United States, or they remain largely aspirational. Still very much a song of the future. Meanwhile, removing Ukrainian resistance doesn't mean Russia suddenly gives up on using force or the threat of force to expand its influence. Quite the opposite, in fact. Russia already has a huge army, an economy increasingly geared for war, and a leadership absolutely dead set on using violence to achieve its political goals. And what does it face in Europe? An opponent that, right now, isn't truly independent in security matters. An opponent without the immediate, robust means to push back hard on its own. In other words, without that Ukrainian buffer, we know Russia's demands will expand. They are already being, in some ways, invited back into the heart of European politics, and almost inevitably at the expense of Central and Eastern European countries, because someone always has to pay the price in these deals. Without Ukraine buying Europe time and space, time to genuinely build its own capabilities, mobilize its resources, America gains enormous, perhaps unprecedented leverage over the continent. Europe remains deeply dependent on the US as its primary security provider. And remember, this might not be the America we thought we knew. They could use that leverage bluntly, perhaps even ruthlessly, to force Europe's hand. Maybe dictate economic alignments, like demanding Europe decouple from China strictly on Trump's terms, or simply manage European security in a way that constantly forces political or economic concessions from European capitals. Managing fear, managing dependence. It's no accident, is it, that the topic of gas comes up so often in these US-Russia discussions? How to carve up the European energy market, discussed by parties supposedly focused only on peace in Ukraine. It was never just about Ukraine. And just imagine this scenario. Ukraine is neutralized. And across Europe, those voices eager to reset relations with Russia? They immediately get louder. They'll be tripping over themselves to sign new deals, make new political and economic agreements with Moscow. Why? Because Europe might feel it has no other realistic choice. The Russians are demanding X. What can we do? We're certainly not going to war with them ourselves. If the United States is no longer acting as a liberal hegemon upholding global rules, but simply as the most powerful nation on earth pursuing its own interests, and that, frankly, is the face America is showing the world right now, then the range of its possible actions becomes vastly different and far less predictable than what we're used to. We are already seeing glimpses of this, so, if these negotiations, whenever they conclude, maybe in a month, maybe in years, who knows, if the end result is effectively a second partition of Ukraine. If Ukraine isn't just divided territorially, which matters of course immensely, but becomes this joint condominium somehow managed by foreign powers. Basically, it's yours, but not really. With no genuine prospect for independent development or long-term security. Then Russia is firmly on the path to dominating the entirety of Ukraine. And that, historically, has massive implications for Russian dominance across all of Central and Eastern Europe. It always spreads. And consider two more critical factors. First, Russia keeps pressuring Europe with the tools it has, mainly force and the threat of force. Second, Europe remains fundamentally dependent on an external power, the US, for its core security. Put those two together? Europe drastically loses its room to maneuver in global politics. Simple as that. Without Ukraine holding the line, Europe's global influence diminishes significantly. If hierarchy in the emerging international system is decided purely, or even primarily, by force, not economic power, not diplomatic skill, not the other factors that perhaps mattered more in recent decades, but raw military strength, then a continent that is economically powerful, but depends entirely on someone else for its security. It becomes a subject, not an independent actor. It becomes part of someone else's game, played by those who do possess the crucial tools of force. Without that million-plus army tying down Russia far from its borders, Europe lacks the independent tools to make the truly critical decisions about its own future. Not just security decisions, but economic ones too. Because these spheres are now so deeply intertwined. And that is why the answer to that initial question, will Ukraine withstand this, is so incredibly, pivotally important right now. Can they resist? Can they continue this defensive war against a nuclear power, potentially even against the shifting wishes of the Americans? It is astonishing, really. The fate of an entire continent hinges, in so many ways, on the resilience of arguably the poorest country on that continent. And Europe's behavior in recent years? Also, astonishing in its own way. Suddenly, we are waking up. Now we want to invest heavily in defense, quickly. It doesn't look great, let's be honest about the timing. But the center of gravity, the point upon which the political future of our continent may very well turn, rests right now on whether the Ukrainians hold out. Something profound to think about. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We'll be back soon with more analysis.